The cantina on Nexus 7 trading station buzzed with the usual mix of voices speaking dozens of alien languages. Smoke from various chemical stimulants created a haze that hung in the recycled air like memories that refused to fade. In the darkest corner booth sat Vextar Helix, his forearms wrapped around his third bottle of Andromedan whiskey. The amber liquid burned differently than Crithian spirits, but it did the job of dulling the sharp edges of his memories. 3 young Crithian soldiers approached his table with the swagger that only came from never seeing real combat. Their crisp uniforms bore no battle scars, and their mandibles clicked with excitement rather than fear. The tallest one, barely past his molting season, slammed his drink down on the scarred metal table. "Vextar Helix," the young soldier announced loudly enough for half the cantina to hear. "The legendary assault commander who fought the humans in the war." Vextar's compound eyes focused slowly on the trio. He recognized the hunger in their faces. Young warriors always sought war stories from veterans, hoping to hear tales of glory and honor. They never wanted to hear the truth. "Go away, younglings," Vextar muttered, taking another long drink. "Find someone else to bother with. Your hero worship." The second soldier, his exoskeleton still showing the bright green of youth, leaned forward eagerly. "We heard you commanded the assault on New Dakota, the first human colony world we attacked. Tell us how easy it was to crush those primitive mammals." A bitter clicking sound escaped Vextar's throat, laughter though it held no humor. "Easy." He repeated the word like it tasted of poison. "You think it was easy." The third soldier, smaller, but with the entitled bearing of highborn caste, gestured dismissively with 2 of his arms. "Come now, Commander. Everyone knows humans had barely mastered spaceflight when the war began. No real military tradition, no advanced weapons, no tactical experience. The Council said they would surrender within days once they saw the might of the Crithian Empire." Vextar stared into his drink for a long moment. Around them, the cantina continued its normal rhythm. Traders haggled over cargo manifest, station workers complained about their shifts, and somewhere in the back a Zephyrian was playing a sad song on a crystalline instrument. Normal sounds of normal lives lived by beings who had never faced humans in battle. "The Council," Vextar finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "knew nothing about humans." The young soldiers exchanged glances. They had expected boastful tales of Crithian superiority, not this quiet bitterness from their war hero. "Tell us what really happened," the tall one pressed. "How did you break their resistance so quickly?" Vextar looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much. "Sit down," he said finally. "If you truly want to know about fighting humans, then sit down and listen, but do not expect glory. Do not expect honor. And do not expect to sleep well tonight after hearing what I have to say." The 3 soldiers settled into the booth across from him, their earlier bravado fading slightly at the intensity in the old veteran's voice. Vextar poured himself another drink with steady hands that betrayed none of the trembling in his voice. "New Dakota was supposed to be our easy victory. A farming colony with maybe 50,000 humans scattered across 3 continents. No military installations, no defense grid, no fleet protection. Intelligence said they raised livestock and grew crops, peaceful settlers who had never seen war." He paused to drink, gathering the strength to continue. "Command assigned me 2 full battle groups, 20,000 elite Crithian warriors, the best the Empire had to offer. Our ships could have glassed the planet from orbit, but the Council wanted prisoners for study. They wanted to understand how human minds worked before we conquered the rest of their species." The young soldiers listened intently, their drinks forgotten. "We landed at dawn near their largest settlement, a place they called Millerville after some human name. Simple buildings, dirt roads, fields of grain stretching to the horizon. I expected to see crowds of humans fleeing in terror or raising white flags of surrender." Vextar's mandibles clicked softly, a nervous habit he had developed during the war years. "Instead, we found them waiting for us. Not cowering in their homes or begging for mercy, waiting armed with primitive projectile weapons and farming tools, led by a human named Jake Morrison. The tall soldier leaned forward. A farmer leading resistance against trained Krithian assault troops. How long did it take to eliminate him and his rabble? 3 weeks, Vextar replied quietly. Silence fell over the table. 3 weeks to defeat untrained farmers should have been impossible for elite Krithian forces. Morrison was nothing special to look at, Vextar continued. Middle-aged, average height for a human, graying hair. He wore simple work clothes and carried an old hunting rifle that fired metal slugs instead of energy beams. But when he spoke, other humans listened. When he pointed, they followed. When he said fight, they fought. The veteran's voice grew distant as he remembered. The first engagement should have ended it. We sent in a full company of shock troopers, expecting quick surrender once the humans saw our superior weapons and armor. Instead, Morrison's people had prepared positions in the grain fields. They used their knowledge of the local terrain against U.S. Vextar drained his glass and immediately refilled it. Human weapons were primitive but effective at close range. Their tactics were unconventional but deadly. They did not stand and fight like civilized warriors. They struck and faded, used the crops for cover, attacked from unexpected angles. The young soldiers shifted uncomfortably. This was not the story of easy conquest they had expected to hear. But worse than their tactics was their persistence, Vextar continued. Krithian doctrine assumes that after suffering reasonable casualties, intelligent enemies will surrender to preserve their remaining forces. Humans did not follow this logic. He stared at something only he could see in the smoky air above their table. Morrison's youngest fighter was barely adult by human standards. 17 years old, armed with a projectile weapon older than he was. I watched him take a plasma burst to the chest that should have killed him instantly. He stayed conscious long enough to trigger explosives that brought down half my command bunker. The silence stretched until the small soldier finally spoke. Surely, after the first few defeats, they realized they could not win against the might of the Empire. Vextar's laugh was completely without humor this time. That was our mistake, youngling. We assumed they were fighting to win. But humans from New Dakota were not fighting to win the war. They were fighting to make us pay for every meter of their soil with Krithian blood. He took another drink and continued. Morrison told his people that if they could hold us for 1 week, reinforcements might arrive from other human worlds. But even when that week passed with no help coming, they kept fighting. Even when 2 weeks passed and half their fighters were dead or wounded, they kept fighting. The veteran's voice dropped to barely a whisper. By the 3rd week, Morrison was dead, so were most of his original fighters. But the humans who remained were no longer the same farmers we had landed to fight. They had learned our tactics, adapted our weapons they captured from our dead, and developed new ways to kill Krithians. Vextar looked directly at each of the young soldiers in turn. That was when I first understood the truth about humans. They do not just fight wars. They evolve during them. Every day we spent on New Dakota, they became more dangerous, more cunning, more willing to sacrifice everything to hurt us. The cantina around them seemed to grow quieter, as if other patrons could sense the darkness of the story being told. When we finally secured Millerville, it was a hollow victory. We had lost nearly 4,000 warriors, defeating 50,000 farmers. And worse, word of the human resistance had already spread to other colonies. The easy conquest, the Council had promised, had become a nightmare that would consume the Empire for 3 more years. Vextar finished his drink and pushed the empty bottle away. That was my first lesson about fighting humans, younglings. They taught me that there are worse things than dying in battle. There is learning to live with the memory of what you had to become to defeat them. The 3 young soldiers sat in stunned silence, their earlier excitement completely gone. This was not the glorious war story they had wanted to hear. The young soldiers ordered another round of drinks, but none of them touched the glasses when they arrived. Vextar could see the doubt creeping into their compound eyes, replacing the eager confidence they had shown earlier. Good, doubt might keep them alive if they ever faced humans in battle. New Dakota was just the beginning, Vexstar said, signaling the server for another bottle. The Council refused to believe that farmers could cause such losses to elite troops. They blamed my tactics, my leadership, my failure to crush primitive resistance quickly enough. The tall soldier cleared his throat nervously. Surely the next campaigns went better once Command learned from the initial setbacks. Vexstar's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement if it had not sounded so bitter. The next campaign nearly broke my mind completely. They sent my strike team to a jungle moon called Kepler 438b. Intelligence reported that human scientists were studying the local ecosystem for potential terraforming techniques. He poured the new bottle with hands that trembled slightly at the memory. 12 researchers and their support staff. 43 humans total on the entire moon. Command assigned my best soldiers for what should have been a simple capture mission. The small soldier leaned forward. 43 civilians against elite Krithian commandos. That must have been the easy victory you needed after New Dakota. Civilians, Vexstar repeated the word slowly. We thought they were civilians too. Dr. Amanda Foster was listed as a xenobiologist. Her assistant Karen Walsh was supposedly a field researcher studying plant specimens. Danny Collins was their equipment technician. The veteran stared into his drink as if seeing faces reflected in the amber liquid. We landed under cover of darkness, standard infiltration protocol. Thermal sensors showed the humans clustered in their research compound about 10 kilometers through dense jungle terrain, simple extraction mission. Vexstar took a long drink before continuing. Walsh and Collins were not in the compound when we arrived. According to the other researchers, they had gone into the jungle 2 days earlier to collect samples from a remote site. Foster insisted they were just delayed by difficult terrain and would return soon. The 3 young Krithians waited silently for him to continue. We secured the compound easily enough. The other humans offered no resistance and seemed genuinely surprised by our presence, but something felt wrong. My tactical instincts, honed by years of combat, warned me that this was too simple. Vexstar's voice grew quieter. The first sign of trouble came on our second night. Corporal Zekman was on perimeter patrol when his communicator went silent. We found his body the next morning, 50 meters from his assigned position. Single projectile wound to the head, fired from extreme range through dense vegetation. The young soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. One sniper kill could be luck, but Vexstar's tone suggested worse was coming. Standard protocol called for immediate extraction with our prisoners, but Command wanted Walsh and Collins captured as well. They ordered us to remain on site and hunt down the missing humans. Vexstar laughed, but the sound held no humor whatsoever. Hunt them down? As if we were the predators and they were the prey. How wrong we were. He drained his glass and immediately refilled it. The second kill happened 12 hours later. Sergeant Dexener, 15 years of combat experience, veteran of 6 campaigns, found him hanging upside down from jungle vines, with his throat cut. His weapons were gone and his equipment had been stripped. The veteran's compound eyes focused on something beyond the cantina walls, seeing events that had happened years ago but felt like yesterday. That was when I realized we were not hunting missing researchers. We were being hunted by something far more dangerous. The tall soldier's voice cracked slightly when he spoke. 2 humans against an elite strike team. Surely you could track them down quickly. Track them, Vexstar repeated. We tried everything. Thermal imaging, scent analysis, motion sensors, aerial reconnaissance. The jungle was dense, but our equipment was superior. We should have found them within hours. He paused to drink, gathering strength for what came next. Instead, they found us. Every night, sometimes twice per night, another of my soldiers would disappear or turn up dead. Always killed with human weapons, always stripped of equipment, always positioned where we would find the body quickly. The small soldier shifted uncomfortably in his seat. What kind of weapons were they using? Advanced human military technology. Hunting knives, Vexstar said simply. Projectile weapons designed for killing jungle animals. Equipment they had. improvised from research tools and scavenged from our dead. Nothing that should have been effective against trained Krithian commandos in full combat armor. The veteran's voice grew distant as he remembered. But Walsh and Collins did not fight. Like soldiers following doctrine, they fought like predators stalking prey. They used the jungle itself as a weapon against us. Vexstar took another drink before continuing. By the fourth day, my soldiers were jumping at shadows and firing at jungle sounds. Sleep became impossible because we never knew when the next attack would come. Food became scarce because we were afraid to hunt or forage in case it was a trap. He stared at his hands wrapped around the glass. The psychological pressure was worse than the actual casualties. Knowing that somewhere in that green hell, 2 humans were watching us, learning our patterns, planning their next strike. The young Krithians listened in growing horror as their war hero described defeat at the hands of researchers armed with improvised weapons. On the 5th night, they made their boldest move yet. Walsh somehow infiltrated our camp while we slept and left origami cranes made from strips of Krithian battle armor next to each sleeping soldier. Vexstar's mandibles clicked nervously. Origami, human art made by folding paper into shapes. Except these were folded from metal taken from our dead comrades. She had been close enough to cut our throats while we slept, but instead left us a message. The tall soldier found his voice. What kind of message? That they were toying with. Yes, Vexstar replied. That our deaths were a choice they were making, not an inevitability they were struggling to achieve. The cranes were beautiful and delicate and absolutely terrifying. The veteran drank again, his hands shaking slightly. That was when I understood another truth about humans. They do not just kill their enemies, they break their spirits first. He looked up at the 3 young soldiers with eyes that seen. Too much. By the 6th day, we were no longer an elite strike team. We were a collection of traumatized survivors waiting for death to find us in the jungle. The cantina around them seemed quieter now, as if other patrons could sense the darkness of the tale being told. Collins appeared first, stepping out of the jungle like a ghost materializing from green shadow. He carried a human rifle and wore clothes that had been camouflaged with mud and plant matter, but what struck me most was his eyes. Vexstar paused, struggling to find words. Human eyes are different from ours. They show emotion more clearly. Collins looked at us with the cold calculation of a predator deciding which prey to take first. The small soldier's voice was barely a whisper. How many of your soldiers survived? 3, Vexstar replied. 3 out of 15 elite commandos. Walsh and Collins could have killed us all, but they chose to let us live. They wanted survivors to carry the story back to command. He finished his drink and pushed the empty glass away. Before we left, Walsh approached me personally. She spoke. Perfect Krithian, which our intelligence had never mentioned. She told me something I will never forget. The young soldiers waited in tense silence. She said that humans had been studying Krithian military doctrine for months before the war began. They knew our tactics, our equipment, our psychological profiles. They had been preparing for this conflict long before we knew they existed as a threat. Vexstar's voice dropped to barely audible levels. But the most terrifying thing she told me was that she and Collins were not soldiers. They really were researchers. Scientists who had learned to hunt and kill trained warriors because the situation demanded it. The veteran looked directly at each young soldier in turn. That was my second lesson about fighting humans. They do not just adapt to war. They transform completely, becoming whatever they need to be to survive. Farmers become guerrilla fighters, scientists become hunters, and civilians become the stuff of nightmares. The 3 young Krithians sat in stunned silence, their earlier enthusiasm for war stories completely extinguished. Around them, the cantina continued its normal rhythm, but their corner booth felt isolated from the ordinary world of trade and commerce. Vexstar signaled for another bottle and settled back into his seat. Would you like to hear about what happened when we faced actual human military forces, younglings? Or have you learned enough about the terror of fighting humans for one night? The three young soldiers had grown pale beneath thetheir chitinous exoskeletons. Their drinks remained untouched while Vextar opened his fourth bottle of the evening. The veteran's hands were steadier now, as if the alcohol was finally doing its job of numbing old wounds. "You want to know about fighting real human military forces," Vextar said without waiting for an answer. "Then let me tell you about Fortress Kethmer, the pride of Crithian defensive engineering." He poured himself another drink and stared into the amber liquid. Kethmar was built on asteroid XK739, positioned to control the main shipping route between human and Crithian space. Impregnable walls, energy shields that could stop battleship cannons, automated defense systems that could track and destroy anything within 1,000 kilometers. The tall soldier found his voice. Surely human forces could not breach such defenses with their primitive technology. Vextar's mandibles clicked in that humorless laugh they were beginning to know too well. Primitive technology. That is what we kept telling ourselves, even after New Dakota, even after the Jungle Moon. We refused to accept that humans might be dangerous opponents. The veteran drank and continued. The human fleet that arrived at Kethmor was indeed primitive by our standards. Old ships, mismatched weapons, hull plating that looked like it had been welded together in backyard workshops. Their flagship was a converted cargo hauler that should have fallen apart under combat stress. He paused, remembering. Admiral Ryan Cooper commanded that ragtag fleet. Intelligence reports described him as a former merchant captain with no formal military training. The Council was confident that our fortress guns would destroy his ships before they could get close enough to be a threat. The small soldier leaned forward despite his obvious fear. What went wrong? "Nothing went wrong with our defenses," Vextar replied. "The shields held, the guns fired perfectly, our tactical systems performed exactly as designed. The problem was that humans did not fight the battle we expected them to fight." The veteran's voice grew quiet as he remembered. Cooper's ships approached in standard attack formation, took heavy losses from our long-range weapons, and retreated just as our doctrine predicted they would. Victory seemed certain. Vextar drained his glass and immediately refilled it. But the retreating human ships left behind debris fields. Chunks of hull plating, broken equipment, what appeared to be the scattered remains of destroyed vessels. Standard battlefield cleanup would wait until after the engagement was complete. The young Crithians waited in tense silence. 12 hours later, that debris came alive. Hidden inside the wreckage were human engineers led by Commander Lisa Rodriguez, a woman who had spent her civilian career fixing broken mining equipment in asteroid fields. The veteran's compound eyes focused on the memory. Rodriguez and her team had somehow survived in vacuum suits inside hollowed-out pieces of ship debris. They used cutting tools designed for salvage work to breach our outer hull in places our sensors could not detect. He took another drink before continuing. But that was just the beginning of their improvisation. Once inside the fortress, Rodriguez's people did not try to fight our soldiers directly. Instead, they began taking apart our own equipment and rebuilding it. The tall soldier's voice cracked slightly. Rebuilding it how? Food processors became explosive devices. Atmospheric recyclers were turned into poison gas dispensers. Lighting systems became high-powered laser cutters. Vextar's voice held a note of horrified admiration. Rodriguez could look at any piece of technology and see a dozen different ways to turn it into a weapon. The veteran paused to drink, gathering strength for what came next. While Rodriguez worked inside our fortress, Cooper's fleet returned for a second attack. But this time they came with ships that looked even more primitive than before. He stared into his glass as if seeing reflections. Of that terrible battle? Supply containers welded to rocket engines and guided by human pilots sitting in improvised cockpits. Mining charges attached to pieces of scrap metal and aimed at our shield generators. Cooper had turned his entire supply train into guided missiles. The small soldier shifted uncomfortably. Surely your defensive systems could handle such crude weapons. Vextar's laugh was completely without humor. Our systems were designed to track and destroy sophisticated missiles and fighters. They could not lock onto debris that was barely holding together and flying in unpredictable patterns. The veteran's voice grew distant. Captain Tony Blake led the Marine assault that followed the improvised missile strike. His soldiers rode inside those makeshift projectiles, strapped into harnesses that should have killed them on impact. He drank again, his hands trembling slightly. Blake's Marines were not equipped with advanced weapons or armor. They carried basic rifles, mining explosives, and tools they had improvised from ship parts. But they fought like nothing I had ever seen before. The young Chrithians listened in growing horror as their war hero described defeat at the hands of improvised weapons and untrained soldiers. The most terrifying thing was watching them work together, Vextar continued. When Blake's assault team needed to breach an armored door, his soldiers did not call for specialized equipment. One Marine held a cutting torch, another provided cover fire, a third prepared explosives, all coordinated without verbal communication. The veteran's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They moved like parts of a single organism, each soldier anticipating what the others needed before they asked for it. No hesitation, no confusion, no wasted motion. He looked up at the three young soldiers with eyes that had seen too much. Rodriguez's sabotage from inside combined with Blake's assault from outside turned our impregnable fortress into a death trap for its own defenders. The cantina around them seemed to grow quieter, as if other patrons could sense the darkness of the story being told. But the worst part came when Cooper's flagship took critical damage from our main guns. His ship was venting atmosphere and losing power, clearly about to be destroyed. Vextar's mandibles clicked nervously. Standard military doctrine in any civilized species calls for damaged command ships to withdraw, while escort vessels provide cover. Cooper should have retreated to preserve his tactical knowledge and experience. The veteran drank and continued. Instead, every human ship in the fleet moved to form a protective sphere around Cooper's damaged vessel. They took devastating losses, ships exploding one after another as they absorbed fire meant for their admiral. He stared at his hands wrapped around the glass. I watched through tactical displays as human captains deliberately positioned their ships between our guns and Cooper's flagship. They were sacrificing themselves for one man, and they did it without hesitation or complaint. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. But Cooper was even more terrifying than his subordinates, Vextar said. When he realized that his survival was costing lives, he made a decision that no rational military commander should ever make. The veteran's voice became barely audible. He ordered his own ship's reactor to overload, creating a massive explosion that destroyed half our remaining defense platforms and cleared the asteroid field of Prithian forces. Vextar finished his drink and pushed the empty glass away. Cooper survived because his crew had already evacuated him to an escape pod against his direct orders. They were willing to disobey their commander to save his life, even while he was trying to sacrifice himself to save theirs. The three young Chrithians could only stare in horrified fascination. That was my third lesson about fighting humans, Vextar said quietly. They do not just use advanced tactics or superior weapons. They use their willingness to die for each other as a strategic advantage that no other species can counter. He looked directly at each young soldier in turn. How do you defeat an enemy who will sacrifice everything for strangers? How do you break the morale of soldiers who consider their own lives less valuable than their mission? How do you negotiate with beings who would rather die than surrender? The veteran signaled for another bottle and settled back into his seat. Fortress Kethmer fell because humans refused to fight the battle we had prepared for. They improvised weapons from debris, turned our own equipment against us, and used their unity as a tactical advantage that our doctrine could not counter. Around them, the normal sounds of the cantina continued, but their corner booth felt isolated from the ordinary world of civilized beings who had never faced humans in combat. Would you like to hear about what happened when we learned to take human unity seriously as a military threat? Vextar asked. Or have you finally understood why? The war lasted 3 years instead of 3 weeks. The cantina had grown quieter as the evening wore on. Other patrons spoke in hushed tones or had left entirely, sensing the heavy atmosphere that surrounded Vextar's table. The three young soldiers no longer showed any trace of their earlier excitement about hearing war stories. Their compound eyes reflected the growing understanding that human warfare was something far more terrifying than they had imagined. Vextar opened his fifth bottle with hands that barely trembled now. The alcohol was doing its work, but the memories remained as sharp as ever. He poured himself another drink and stared at the amber liquid as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "The battle above Kepher Prime's third moon," he said finally. "That was where I learned the most disturbing truth about human military operations." The tall soldier cleared his throat nervously. After Fortress Kethmer fell, surely Command developed better strategies for fighting human forces. Vextar's mandibles clicked in what had become his signature humorless laugh. "Better strategies? Yes, we thought we had learned from our mistakes. We studied human tactics, analyzed their improvisation techniques, prepared countermeasures for their unity. In battle." He took a long drink before continuing. "Admiral Zekfel himself commanded our fleet at Kepher. 300 ships, the largest force the Empire had ever assembled for a single engagement. We outnumbered the human fleet 5-1 in our. Individual ships were superior in every measurable way." The veteran's voice grew distant as he remembered. The humans came with 60 ships under Admiral Ryan Cooper, the same man who had destroyed Fortress Kethmer. Intelligence suggested he had been promoted beyond his abilities and would make tactical errors under the pressure of commanding such a large engagement. The small soldier leaned forward despite his obvious fear. Surely those odds guaranteed victory for Krithian forces. "Numbers?" Vextar replied quietly. "We put all our faith in numbers and superior technology. But humans had been teaching us throughout the war that neither mattered as much as we believed." The veteran paused to drink, gathering strength for what came next. The battle began according to standard protocols. Both fleets approached in formation, exchanged long-range fire, maneuvered for tactical advantage. For the first 2 hours, everything proceeded exactly as our doctrine predicted. He stared into his glass as if seeing reflections of that terrible battle. Then Cooper's flagship took a direct hit from our main battle line. The ship's hull was breached in multiple locations, life support was failing, and weapon systems were offline. Vextar's compound eyes focused on something beyond the cantina walls. Any rational commander would have withdrawn his damaged vessel to a safe distance and continued the battle from his remaining ships. Cooper should have preserved his command capability and tactical knowledge. The young Krithians waited in tense silence. Instead, Cooper broadcast an open message to his entire fleet. Not encrypted, not coded, transmitted on frequencies we could monitor. He told his captains that his ship was finished, but the mission would continue. The veteran's voice grew quieter. What happened next defied everything we knew about military logic and self-preservation instincts. He drank again, his hands shaking slightly at the memory. Every human ship in the fleet, without exception, changed course to form a protective formation around Cooper's dying flagship. Not just the escort vessels or ships from his direct command structure. Every single human captain in that battle voluntarily moved their ship into the kill zone to protect their admiral. The tall soldier's voice cracked. They abandoned tactical advantage to save one man. Worse than that, Vextar replied. They abandoned any hope of survival. Our guns were concentrated on that sector, and human ships were taking massive casualties as they formed their protective sphere. The veteran's voice became barely audible. I watched Captain Susan Martinez pilot her fighter directly into the path of plasma torpedoes aimed at Cooper's ship. Her fighter was destroyed instantly, but the torpedoes detonated harmlessly against her hull instead of reaching their target. He paused, struggling to find words for what he had witnessed. Martinez had 3 seconds to make that decision. 3 seconds to choose between self-preservation and certain death to save a stranger. She did not hesitate. The young soldiers sat in horrified silence as their war hero described the incomprehensible courage of human warriors. Commander Greg Thompson was Cooper's tactical officer aboard the damaged flagship, Vextar continued. When life support failed completely, Thompson and his bridge crew had enough emergency oxygen for maybe 10 minutes. The veteran drank and continued. Instead of using that oxygen to evacuate to escape pods, Thompson's team spent those 10 minutes coordinating the defensive formation and transmitting tactical data to the other human ships. He looked up at the three young soldiers with eyes that had seen too much. They suffocated at their posts rather than abandon their duty to protect the fleet. The cantina around them seemed to grow quieter, as if other patrons could sense the darkness of the tale being told. But the most terrifying part was what Cooper did when he realized what his people were sacrificing for him, Vextar said. Any sane commander would have been grateful for the protection and used it to escape. The veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. Cooper countermanded every evacuation order his crew tried to give him. He refused to leave his ship while other humans were dying to protect it. He stared at his hands wrapped around the glass. When his bridge crew physically tried to force him into an escape pod, Cooper activated the ship's self-destruct sequence. He was going to blow up his own vessel rather than let more humans die for his survival. The small soldier found his voice. What stopped him? His crew, Vextar replied simply. Chief Engineer Bill Harris had been monitoring Cooper's neural patterns and predicted the suicide attempt. Harris manually overrode the self-destruct and initiated emergency beam-out procedures. The veteran's voice grew distant. Cooper materialized on Harris's ship already fighting to return to his dying flagship. It took 6 human Marines to physically restrain their own admiral to prevent him from going back. He took another drink before continuing. That was when I understood the most disturbing truth about human military psychology. They do not just fight for each other. They compete to see who can sacrifice more for their comrades. Vextar looked directly at each young soldier in turn. How do you defeat an enemy where the lowest-ranking soldier will die to save a stranger, where officers will sacrifice themselves rather than let subordinates take risks, where commanders would rather destroy themselves than accept protection from their troops? The 3 young Crithians could only stare in fascinated horror. The battle at Kethver lasted 16 hours, Vextar continued. By the end, Cooper's fleet had been reduced to 12 functional ships out of 60 that entered the engagement. Any rational military force would have surrendered or retreated hours earlier. He finished his drink and immediately refilled it. Instead, those 12 ships were grouped around Cooper, who had transferred his command to a damaged escort vessel, and continued fighting until Crithian ammunition began running low. The veteran's voice dropped to barely audible levels. We won the battle by technical standards. We held the field and inflicted heavier casualties than we sustained. But our fleet was so damaged by human sacrifice tactics that we had to withdraw from the entire sector. He stared into his glass as if seeing faces reflected in the amber liquid. And that was my 4th lesson about fighting humans. Their willingness to die for each other is not just individual heroism. It is a coordinated military strategy that turns self-sacrifice into tactical advantage. Around them, the normal sounds of the cantina continued, but their corner booth felt isolated from the ordinary world of beings who valued self-preservation above duty. Admiral Zechthel was demoted after Kethver, Vextar said quietly. Command blamed his tactics for failing to achieve decisive victory against inferior forces. But Zechthel understood what the council refused to accept. The young soldiers waited for him to continue. Human unity is not a weakness to exploit or a strength to counter, Vextar said. It is a fundamental aspect of their species that makes conventional military doctrine useless against them. He signaled for another bottle and settled back into his seat. Would you like to hear about what happened when we finally accepted that humans could not be defeated by standard warfare? Or have you learned enough about the terror of fighting an enemy who loves their comrades more than they fear death? The 6th bottle sat half empty between Vextar's 4 arms as he stared into the smoky darkness of the cantina. The 3 young soldiers had long since abandoned any pretense of drinking their own beverages. They sat transfixed by the horror. Stories their war hero was telling, each tale more disturbing than the last. You want to know the most terrifying thing about humans, Vextar said without looking up from his glass. It is not their unity or their improvisation or their willingness to die for strangers. The tall soldier's voice was barely a whisper. What could be worse than everything you have already told us? Vextar's compound eyes focused on the young Crithian with an intensity that made him shrink back in his seat. They learn during combat. While you are fighting them, they are studying you, adapting to your tactics, becoming more dangerous with every engagement. The veteran poured himself another drink with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The alcohol was numbing more than just his memories now. Dr. Amanda Foster was the human who taught me this lesson. The same xenobiologist who had been studying plants on that jungle moon where Walsh and Collins hunted my strike team. He took a long drink before continuing. After the disaster at Kethver, Command decided that humans were too dangerous to fight with conventional tactics. They assigned Foster to a prisoner exchange program, supposedly to study Crithian biology for medical purposes. The small soldier leaned forward despite his obvious fear. A scientist studying prisoners hardly seems like a military threat. Vextar's mandibles clicked in that bitter laugh they had learned to dread. Foster was no longer just a scientist. 18 months of war had changed her into something else entirely. Something that could smile politely while planning your destruction. The veteran's voice grew distant as he remembered. She spent 3 weeks in our detention facility, treating wounded Crithian prisoners with remarkable skill. Foster saved dozens of lives and asked for nothing in return except permission to learn about our anatomy and psychology. He stared into his glass as if seeing faces reflected in the amber liquid. What we did not understand was that Foster was not just treating our wounded. She was conducting the most comprehensive intelligence operation in military history. The young Crithians waited in tense silence. Foster learned to speak perfect Crithian in 6 days by listening to prisoner conversations. She memorized our military rank structure by observing how soldiers interacted with their officers. She identified our psychological pressure points by watching how different individuals responded to stress. Vextar's voice became quieter. But worse than gathering intelligence, Foster was actively recruiting. She convinced 12 Crithian prisoners to work with human forces, not through torture or threats, but by demonstrating genuine care for their welfare. The tall soldier's voice cracked. Crithian soldiers would never betray the Empire. They did not see it as betrayal, Vextar replied. Foster presented collaboration as a way to end the war more quickly and save lives on both sides. She was extraordinarily persuasive because she actually believed what she was saying. The veteran drank and continued. When Foster returned to human territory, she brought detailed knowledge of Crithian military doctrine, equipment specifications, and psychological profiles. But more importantly, she brought a new understanding of how to fight us. He looked up at the 3 young soldiers with eyes that had seen too much. Within 6 weeks, human forces were using modified Crithian tactics against us. They had reverse-engineered our plasma weapons and improved the design. They were speaking our language during combat operations and using our own communication protocols to spread confusion. The cantina around them seemed to grow quieter as other patrons sensed the darkness of the story being told. Corporal Steve Williams was a perfect example of human adaptation, Vextar continued. When the war began, Williams was a simple infantry soldier with no special training or advanced equipment. Standard human grunt, as they called themselves. The veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. By the war's end, Williams was leading combined human-alien resistance cells, coordinating attacks across 3 star systems, and speaking 6 different alien languages fluently. He paused to drink, gathering strength for what came next. Williams did not receive formal education or specialized training. He learned everything through combat experience and interaction with captured equipment. The small soldier shifted uncomfortably. One soldier cannot represent an entire species. Williams was not unique, Vextar said quietly. Human forces were full of similar transformations. Engineers became tactical specialists, medics became intelligence analysts, pilots became ground combat experts. The veteran's voice grew distant. They did not just cross-train in different specialties. They evolved during the war, becoming more capable and more dangerous with every month that passed. He stared at his hands wrapped around the glass. Dr. Foster exemplified this evolution. She went from studying plant specimens to conducting psychological warfare operations. Her techniques for turning prisoners were so effective that command eventually refused all prisoner exchanges. The young soldiers sat in horrified silence as their war hero described an enemy that grew stronger through conflict. But the most disturbing example of human learning was their medical corps, Vextar continued. Human medics began the war able to treat only their own species. Basic knowledge, primitive techniques, limited equipment. The veteran took another drink before continuing. By the war's end, human medics were performing surgery on wounded Crithians, Zephyrians, and Andromedans. They had developed field procedures for treating alien physiology that our own doctors had not discovered. He looked directly at each young soldier in turn. Human medics were saving the lives of enemy soldiers on active battlefields, not for intelligence purposes, but because they believed all life had value. The tall soldier found his voice. Why would they heal enemies who might return to fight them? Because healing was becoming as natural to them as fighting, Vextar replied. They were evolving into something that could wage war and show mercy. Simultaneously, the veteran's voice dropped to barely audible levels. Chief Medical Officer Janet Price performed emergency surgery on me after the Battle of Zarian Station. I was dying from plasma burns and internal bleeding when her unit found me. He stared into his glass as if seeing memories reflected there. Price spent 14 hours keeping me alive while human and Crithian forces fought around the medical station. She could have let me die or used me for intelligence, but instead she saved my life and asked for nothing in return. The three young Crithians could only stare in fascinated horror. That was my fifth lesson about fighting humans, Vextar said quietly. They do not just adapt to war. They evolve beyond it, becoming something greater than what they were when the fighting began. He finished his drink and immediately refilled it. Price told me something while I was recovering that I will never forget. She said that humans had been preparing for interstellar war for thousands of years through their own internal conflicts. The veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. Every human had ancestors who survived warfare, famine, disease, and natural disasters. They carried genetic and cultural memory of overcoming impossible odds. He signaled for another bottle and settled back into his seat. The war did not teach humans how to fight. It simply awakened capabilities that had been dormant in their species for generations. Around them, the normal sounds of the cantina continued, but their corner booth felt isolated from the ordinary world of beings who had never witnessed the terrifying adaptability of human warriors. Would you like to hear about the final human lesson I learned? Vextar asked. The one that made me understand why the war had to end and why we could never fight them again. The cantina had grown almost empty as the night cycle progressed on Nexus 7 station. Most patrons had drifted away hours ago, leaving only a few die-hard drinkers and shift workers grabbing quick meals between duties. The air recyclers hummed quietly, struggling to clear the accumulated smoke and conversation from the evening's crowds. Vextar sat hunched over his seventh bottle, forearms wrapped around the amber liquid like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The three young soldiers across from him looked pale and shaken, their earlier enthusiasm for war stories completely extinguished by the horror of what they had heard. The final lesson, Vextar said without looking up from his drink. The one that broke my mind completely and made me understand why the Empire surrendered. The tall soldier's voice was barely a whisper. What could be worse than everything you have already told us? Before Vextar could answer, the cantina's main door slid open with a soft hiss. A figure in a worn flight jacket entered, scanning the room briefly before heading toward the bar. Human, female, middle-aged with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much of the galaxy's darker corners, The three young Crithians tensed instinctively at the sight of a human, their hands moving unconsciously toward weapons that were not there. Vextar noticed their reaction and made a sound that might have been laughter if it had contained any humor. "Captain Helen Price," he said quietly. "Independent freighter captain, runs supplies between the outer colonies and the core worlds." The young soldiers watched nervously as Price ordered a drink at the bar, seemingly unaware of their presence in the darkened corner booth. "You know this human?" the small soldier asked, his voice tight with fear. "We have met before," Vextar replied. "She comes through Nexus 7 every few months on her trade route. Always stops in this cantina, always orders the same drink." The veteran took a long pull from his bottle before continuing. "Price was chief medical officer aboard the human hospital ship Mercy during the war. The same woman who saved my life. At Zarian Station." Price finished her transaction at the bar and turned to survey the cantina. Her eyes found Vextar's table immediately, as if she had been looking for him specifically. She approached slowly, her movements careful and non-threatening. "Evening, Vextar," she said in accented but fluent Crithian. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" The three young soldiers stared in shock as the human addressed their war hero by name and spoke their language perfectly. Vextar gestured to an empty chair with one of his arms. "Captain Price," he replied. "These younglings were just hearing about the war." Price settled into the chair and studied the three young Crithians with eyes that seemed to see straight through their nervous bravado. "First time hearing real war stories, I'm guessing." The tall soldier found his voice, though it cracked slightly. "You were there, during the fighting." 3 years, start to finish," Price confirmed. "Saw more wounded and dying on both sides than I care to remember." She turned to Vextar with something that might have been concern. "You telling them about Zarian Station?" "Getting to it," Vextar replied. "I was just explaining about learning and adaptation." Price nodded slowly. "Hard lesson for everyone involved." The veteran poured himself another drink with hands that had begun shaking again. These younglings wanted to hear about glorious Crithian victories and easy conquests of primitive humans. "Not much glory in war," Price said quietly. "Just people trying to survive and get home to their families." The small soldier leaned forward despite his obvious fear. "You saved his life. Why would you help an enemy soldier?" Price looked at him with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Because that is what medics do. We heal people. Doesn't matter what species they are or which side they fight for." She gestured toward Vextar with her drink. "He was dying. When we found him, plasma burns over 60% of his body, internal bleeding, severe shock. Any reasonable person would have written him off as unsavable." The veteran's mandibles clicked nervously. "Price spent 14 hours keeping me alive while the battle raged around us. Her medical station was hit 3 times by artillery, but she never stopped working." "Had good help," Price said simply. "My team included 2 Crithian medics who had been captured earlier. They knew your anatomy better than we did." The young soldiers stared in shock. Crithian medics were helping human forces. "By then, most of us had stopped seeing enemies," Price explained. "We were just medical personnel trying to save lives. Crithian, human, didn't matter anymore." Vextar took another drink, gathering strength for what came next. "That was when I learned the final and most terrifying truth about humans." He looked directly at the 3 young soldiers. "They can hate you enough to destroy your fleets, kill your soldiers, and burn your worlds. But they can also love you enough to risk their own lives saving yours." Price nodded slowly. "War brings out the worst in people, but sometimes it brings out the best, too." The veteran's voice became barely audible. "Price could have let me die and saved herself hours of dangerous work under combat conditions. Instead, she treated me like I was one of her own wounded." He stared at his hands wrapped around the glass. When I asked her why, she said something that haunts me to this day. The cantina had grown completely quiet around them, as if the universe itself was waiting for this revelation. She said that every wounded soldier was somebody's son or daughter, somebody's parent or sibling or friend, that behind every uniform was a person who just wanted to go home. Price finished her drink and stood to leave. War ends eventually. People have to live with what they did and who they became. Better to live knowing you saved lives than knowing you could have saved them and chose not to. She placed a few credits on the table to cover Vextar's drinks, as she apparently did every time she visited the station. "Take care of yourself, old soldier," she said in Crithian. "And maybe go easy on the war stories. These kids look like they've heard enough horror for one night." Price left the cantina without looking back, disappearing into the station's corridors like a ghost from a half-remembered nightmare. The three young soldiers sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. "That is the final lesson about fighting humans," Vextar said quietly. "They do not just wage war or make peace. They do both simultaneously, in the same moment, sometimes to the same person." The veteran finished his drink and pushed the bottle away. "The Empire surrendered because we finally understood what we were fighting. Not just another species competing for resources or territory, but beings capable of impossible contradictions." He looked at each young soldier in turn. "How do you defeat an enemy who can kill you without hatred and save you without reward? How do you negotiate with beings who treat enemies like family and friends like enemies depending on the circumstances?" The tall soldier's voice was barely a whisper. "How do we avoid war with them in the future?" "By remembering what I have told you tonight," Vextar replied. "Humans are not just another species to conquer or avoid. They are mirrors that reflect whatever you bring to them." He stood unsteadily, the alcohol finally taking its toll. "Approach them with violence, and they will show you levels of warfare that will break your spirit. Approach them with respect, and they will show you kindness that will heal your soul." The veteran gathered his coat and prepared to leave. "The choice is always yours, younglings. But choose carefully, because humans will respond to whatever path you select with an intensity that will change you forever." As Vextar walked toward the cantina's exit, his voice carried back to the three stunned soldiers. "That is why the war ended and why it can never happen again. Because we learned that fighting humans does not just risk your life or your fleet or your empire." He paused at the door, looking back one final time. "Fighting humans risks your soul. And some risks are too great for any rational being to take twice." The cantina door slid shut behind him, leaving the three young Crithians alone with their thoughts and the terrible understanding that the universe contained beings far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined outside. Somewhere in the station's corridors, a human freighter captain continued her rounds, checking on old enemies turned unlikely friends, carrying the burden of memories that bound former warriors together across the vast darkness of space. The war was over, but its lessons would echo through the galaxy for generations to come.